PhD.
Okay, Matthew Meyer. He is what an anthropologist, correct? Anthropologist. He's also aces on economics, and if you've seen in the record searchlight, they really, really like to pay attention to what he says. All right, give it up. It's Matthew Meyer.
Dr. Tammy, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here today, and also for putting on this event and the last Cannery talk that you did. I think they're really important events. I'm not going to talk today about the medicinal use of cannabis. Plenty of other speakers are addressing that issue, people who are medical doctors, researchers, and patients. As an anthropologist, I'm more concerned with the social and cultural dynamics around the topic of cannabis and its changing status at this moment in time. What I want to do today, then, is to spend a few minutes, can you hear me in the back there? Yep. Is to spend a few minutes discussing the history of efforts to regulate medical marijuana in Shasta County and reflecting on some of the context of these efforts. To anticipate a bit, I'm going to argue that you can't effectively regulate cannabis if you try to ban it. That the urge to ban is a form of message politics rather than a well-reasoned policy response. And that much of the public discourse about cannabis in Shasta County presents a distorted picture of medical marijuana as a cause of social ills in itself. So this is a really quick and very selective overview of cannabis law in California. In 1996, California voters passed the nation's first medical marijuana law, which, brief as it was, clearly articulated the principle that people in this state should be able, without the threat of criminal penalty, to access marijuana if their doctor recommended it. Next month marks 18 years since the law was passed. In that time, California's people and elected officials have failed for various reasons, ranging from political cowardice to real and thorny issues of states' rights versus federal power and other reasons, to fulfill Prop 215's purpose to implement a plan to provide for the safe and affordable distribution of marijuana to all patients in medical need of marijuana. Under Prop 215, millions of Californians have been able to access cannabis, and there are parts of the state where the law works well. But there are also large swaths of California where Prop 215 has, practically speaking, been rolled back, leaving qualified patients subject to criminal prosecution as they try to obtain their medicine.
Called Pursuit of Happiness. Yes.
Passed in 2003, SB 420 was the most significant attempt to date to try to clarify the rules for medical marijuana. But it was hampered from the get-go by struggles between law enforcement, the law enforcement lobby, and cannabis-friendly sponsors like the late John Vasconcellos. Probably the most enduring legacy of SB 420 today is not even legally valid anymore. The widespread 6-12-8 rule of thumb among patients. That's the notion that each qualified patient may cultivate at least 6 mature plants or 12 immature ones and possess up to 8 ounces of flower. This rule was doubly defeated, struck down by the courts because the amount cultivated should be relative to the patient's medical needs. It could be more. And it was also made moot because local land use laws, about which I'll say more in a moment, have succeeded in banning all cultivation in some locales. The rise of the dispensary model. Another important legacy of SB 420 was to codify the concept of collective cultivation projects, which provided the rationale for co-op style brick-and-mortar dispensaries, where some members cultivated cannabis for the rest, who would contribute monetary donations through which the growers would be reimbursed. The legality of this model has been one of the most hotly debated issues around medical marijuana in California. The lack of clear statewide guidelines for the production and distribution of cannabis under Prop 215 opened what remains a broad gray area in which the industry was able to develop but kept marginalized, for example, by being denied access to banks, all cash business. Overall, cannabis production and distribution thrived as dispensaries sprang up to serve large markets in the Bay Area and Southern California. They obtained some of their inventory from local indoor production, but relied on Northern California outdoor-grown cannabis for the bulk of their supply. As we consider how to regulate cannabis production in the North State, this is an important detail to keep in mind. No other cannabis market in the country, including Washington and Colorado, has a comparable level of inexpensive outdoor production. Any regulation made without considering this fact runs the risk of being undermined by unauthorized competition. By 2009, hundreds of dispensaries were reported to operate in Los Angeles. More pot shops than Starbucks, the media infamously declared. That same year also saw the feds issue the so-called Ogden Memo. The memo advised U.S. attorneys in medical marijuana states that they should not focus federal resources on individuals whose actions are in clear and unambiguous compliance with existing state laws providing for the medical use of marijuana. Although the announcement made no permanent policy changes and was in fact walked back a short time later, it appeared to many people in California and elsewhere to represent a sea change in federal policy and to give a green light to the dispensary model. This perception led to an explosion in the cannabis industry, but a backlash soon followed. The land use strategy. The blowback came both at the state and federal levels. While the feds raided dispensaries and sent letters threatening asset forfeiture to landlords who rented to them, a slew of California cities and counties imposed first moratoria on dispensaries and then bans beginning in 2009. Dispensary bans relied on the broad powers of local governments to determine land use regulations within their boundaries. The strategy was widely disseminated, if not invented, by legal counsel for the League of California Cities, which convened a subcommittee to figure out how to assert control over the burgeoning cannabis industry. In 2009, the focus was on dispensaries. As courts affirmed local land use rights in medical marijuana cases, though, the strategy expanded. After 2011, new land use ordinances took aim at cultivation as well, culminating in the California Supreme Court's refusal in early 2014 to review the total cultivation ban enacted by the city of Live Oak. So the land use tab has been wildly successful, legally speaking, using local law to accomplish, at least on paper, a full-fledged reversal of Prop 215 in certain localities. Shasta County joined this land use party somewhat late, passing its first medical marijuana ordinance in 2011 over the objections of dozens of local patients who said it wouldn't allow them to meet their medical needs. That ordinance, which is still in effect today, banned dispensaries from unincorporated areas of the county and put graduated square footage limits, varying with parcel size, on outdoor cannabis gardens, among other measures. By early 2013, Shasta supervisors were considering further restriction of medical marijuana cultivation through zoning and nuisance rules, and chose to cleave close to the cutting edge of the backlash, following places like Fresno into a ban on outdoor cultivation. The supervisors passed the new ordinance this past winter, and it's only because of a successful signature gathering effort that we have the chance to vote on the ban November 4th. In choosing the outdoor ban, the supervisors went against the recommendations of the Planning Commission, which had presented several other options that, while more restrictive than the present ordinance, stopped short of a ban. While patients were puzzled by such apparently excessive zeal, it made sense in light of the narrative peddled by the local political, law enforcement, and treatment industry representatives who stood to gain job security with the continued stigmatization of cannabis. That narrative ran in short like this. Most cannabis cultivation in Shasta County is profit-driven and illicit, using Prop 215 for moral and legal cover. Growing and distributing cannabis is inherently dangerous, so that as production increases, so does harm to the public. Restricting cannabis production will therefore lessen violence, pollution, water theft, teenage deviance, and so forth. There's at least 3 objections to this vision. One is that very, very few medical marijuana patients will be able to grow for themselves under the proposed rules. Consider, only cultivation in an inspected, permitted outbuilding or greenhouse is allowed. The outbuilding must have a foundation, solid walls, a full roof, an air filtration system, an alarm, and a locking door with a limit of 50 amps power and 2,000 watts illumination. The greenhouse can use natural light, but it must be made of rigid panels, have a locking door, and be permitted and inspected. In any case, only 12 plants may be grown. The vast majority of patients, it seems clear, will never have the chance. Local news reports estimate the cost of such a structure at $12,000, which is too much for many on a fixed income to afford. What is more, renters are, for practical purposes, disqualified as a class. Under this ordinance, they'd have to get the landlord's notarized permission to cultivate, then invest all those thousands of dollars to build a grow room on property that doesn't even belong to them. This is what advocates are talking about when they say that the ordinance, which in fact ramps up violations from infractions to misdemeanors, will make criminals of thousands of Shasta County medical marijuana patients who cannot afford to follow its rules. Another serious objection is that the proposed outdoor ban promises the moon to citizens concerned about the impacts of cannabis cultivation, but leaves real questions about how it will achieve its goals. For example, proponents seem to assume that the ordinance will magically make pot go away, taking many of our social problems with it. But that view ignores economic incentives that make it likely that commercial-scale cultivation will persist in Shasta County, ban or no ban. By my own purposely conservative estimates, there were likely at least 1,000 outdoor gardens in the county last year, producing $100 million or more in wholesale value. Quite apart from our opinions about the morality or legality of these grows, that's a lot of incentive that should be taken into account in crafting Shasta's cannabis policy. A third problem with the vision represented by Measure A has to do with allocation of law enforcement resources. We have to ask ourselves, is the cultivation of cannabis really a top threat to public safety in Shasta County? If it were, it might be prudent to design an ordinance that makes a distinction between small and large-scale operations, so that small growers could feel safe and officers would be guaranteed to spend their allotment of cannabis resources going after the minority of truly problematic scenes in our midst. Instead, this plan lumps everyone together by making a single outdoor plant illegal. Both the Sheriff's Office and Code Enforcement have suffered budget cuts in recent years that have affected their level of service. With the grand jury just this year blasting Shasta County's permitting and nuisance abatement processes. With plenty of other work to do, why are they so focused on cannabis? There is reason to believe that the priorities of the Sheriff's Office at least may be skewed by the promise of supplemental federal funding if enough of the budget goes to cannabis eradication. Sheriff Tom Bosenko acknowledged as much to the Wall Street Journal in 2010, admitting that cannabis is not the biggest problem he faces in Shasta County, but that it's, quote, where the money is. In sum, Measure A seems intended to curtail cannabis production rather than to provide a sensible means by which to produce and distribute it in Shasta County. It offers patients a slim chance to grow their own medicine. But the implausibility of the scenarios under which that could actually happen, particularly for renters, makes it a de facto cultivation ban. Coupled with the existing ban on dispensaries in the county, Measure A would require many patients who now grow their own cannabis to travel significant distances to visit one of the 2 dispensaries in Shasta County, making access more expensive, time-consuming, and difficult. We need and deserve a better plan than this. We live in one of the best climates in the world for cannabis production, and if make it go away isn't a real option, we need to find an alternative. 3 more states vote on adult use legalization this November. California is all but guaranteed to vote on a similar proposal in 2016, and may see a medical marijuana regulation bill before that. Last year, for the first time, polls showed a majority of Americans favor adult use legalization. And the federal government has, so far, honored its word to allow Colorado and Washington to pursue alternative cannabis policies. Isn't it time that we insisted on having a seat at the table here in Shasta County so that we can help develop a policy that looks toward the future rather than one that clings out of fear to past prejudices?
Yeah.
Thank you.